While so many cities, especially here in Europe, are redefining their urban development, scaling back their planning to something really more life-size, something that predated the automobile. Things are very different here in Copenhagen and in Denmark, where they are planning mega projects like it is the 1950s. The big bad one at the moment is something I've covered here on the channel, Lynetteholm, this proposed artificial island at the head of the harbor. And one of the things with mega projects that I've noticed is that there is a fascination bias among the general population and the politicians that are involved. Oh my God, it is so big, it's so shiny and amazing, it has to be a good thing. And all rational thought disappears. The other thing that I've noticed is that once a mega project is approved, there is this kind of surrenderism. Oh, okay, they voted yes to that, so it's gonna happen, right? So we can't do anything about that. But that is something that I want to talk about today. The failed mega projects of Copenhagen. Huge transformational mega projects, negative for urban life, absolutely, that were planned, voted for, set into motion, and yet disappeared. But it's important to remember that there is often still hope. There is still a battle to be won, because mega projects can die. Urban development mega projects are usually something that we connect with the years after the Second World War, when the car, the automobile, started its advance on our cities and we desperately tried to make space for it. But here in Copenhagen, these mega projects and that mentality has a longer history. We can go back to 1910. The city government here had plans for a tunnel under the harbor to the island of Amager. And you got to see where they planned this tunnel. Nyhavn, the most picture-perfect postcard tourist area with all the colored houses, all the old ships along the canal. They were just going to drain that and run tram lines under the harbor to the other side. Luckily, that never happened. So why have I brought you here to the park today? It's because this is one of the locations of probably the hugest mega project ever planned in the city of Copenhagen, called Søringen, the Lake Ring. A massive motorway leading down from the ferry over to Sweden. It was going to sweep right down here to the lakes and onwards to the south of the city. The Lake Ring project was first planned and proposed in 1958. This was the future of urban development all over the world, and it lived until 1973. In all of that time, people thought this was going to happen. It was a given that the Lake Ring was coming. The Lake Ring was planned to be an integral part of the national strategy that saw the light of day in the 1950s, the Big H. A plan to connect Denmark with motorways, inspired like the US and many other countries by Hitler's Autobahn network. The first motorway in Denmark opened in 1956. The work on the Big H, by and large, was completed. But now the current crop of politicians are doubling down and even planning another mega project, the Kattegat connection, with more destructive motorway. Reading all the old documents from back then is pretty scary. You also get to read passages like this from 1954. The plan regards the massive bicycle traffic in the city's streets as a spatial problem that must be addressed. Cyclists must be encouraged to take the tram instead. Trams take up less space in the city. Yeah, that was a different age. This park is called Amorparken and it dates from 1910. But back then, it was this beautiful park, landscaped gardens right outside the main entrance to the old National Hospital, which is long gone because they built this monster, the new National Hospital, in 1970. The motorway was going to just run straight through this park, so it would cease to exist completely. Even today, even when there's leaves on the trees here, it still is a kind of a non-place because it's stuck between this old-fashioned, brutalist nightmare of a hospital building and an incredibly busy road. On the other side of the street is one of Copenhagen's ugliest buildings, the Panum Institute. That was built because the motorway, of course, it is coming. So right here where I'm standing in this park, if everything went according to plan, I would be buried in asphalt and there'd be, I don't know, 60, 100,000 cars above me roaring down towards the iconic lakes of Copenhagen. Now I've moved a bit farther down from the first park. You can see where the motorway would have been placed. Now, up there was an existing park that would have died under the asphalt. Here, it was a quite different story. If I stood here in 1970, I would be in the middle of a densely populated, amazing Copenhagen neighborhood. Just like the buildings here, they extended right onto this spot and out into the wide street off to the side here. But they were flattened, raised to the ground to make space for more cars. Now, there were many actors through decades who all had their fingers involved, but here in Copenhagen, there really is one protagonist, or if you like, antagonist. The most ironically named mayor in the history of urbanism, Urban Hansen. In Danish, we say Urban Hansen. New York had Robert Moses just bulldozing his way through the poor neighborhoods to make shiny new motorways for the future. Here, we had Urban.
Urban Hansen was the Lord Mayor of Copenhagen from 1962 to 1976. He drank the American Kool-Aid and went to work planning massive motorways, as well as brutal redevelopment that cleared out undesirable, low-income neighborhoods. He built social housing developments that later failed miserably, and he was the man who ripped out the Copenhagen tram network after 109 years, replacing them with buses in 1972. He was one of the main proponents of the Lake Ring and all the other motorway megaprojects. Calling him the Robert Moses of Copenhagen is not an understatement. I would go as far as to say that he was the most destructive mayor in the history of this city.
In 1973, when the Lake Ring project finally was killed, that man was pissed off. It was one of his main visions for the future of Copenhagen. He was so pissed off that he just knocked down this entire neighborhood right here anyway, in order to widen the highway and in the hope that the Lake Ring project at some point in the future would happen. So we're left with another space where there was life until the 1970s, and now that's gone. So I came from the other side of the street in the park, and I'm standing here now. But here from this vantage point, you can really see what it would have been like with this motorway roaring down from the north of Copenhagen, and the space that was desperately made to accommodate it, past these brutalist 1970s buildings. And also, it's really easy to get an idea of what it would have looked like because we still have this hangover, this big, stupid road, which serves no purpose to the people of Copenhagen. At least there's a bus rapid transit running down the middle now, but still, this is a hangover that many cities are still struggling with. But hey, this is just the tip of the iceberg in the Lake Ring story. The motorway would have come through here, and then it would have hit our iconic lakes, and it would have turned right, and it would have continued to the western neighborhoods, all the way as far as the eye can see from here.
In a way, it's hard to imagine what it would have looked like as I cycle along the lakes. But then again, maybe not. I've seen it in so many cities where it was allowed to happen. The Lake Ring would have cut off access to most of the shoreline, and in places, it would have been high enough to reach the level of the second floor of the buildings along this stretch. The level of commitment to selling this idea is reflected in the many massive models of the project that were made in wood and plaster. Clearly, communication was a key strategy. This applies also to the drawings and renderings in the proposal. And all of these drawings, like we still see today in architectural renderings, feature very few cars. Yeah, right. I've seen the plans for insane motorways in other cities here in the region. Stockholm infamously was the only Nordic city that actually did it, and they continue to struggle with that legacy. But there were also plans for Oslo and Helsinki. And farther afield, there's Amsterdam, Glasgow, Paris, Vancouver, and many other cities.
Luckily, none of them ended up being built. This is where the Lake Ring project would meet its evil twin. If these people had their way, it would have met City Plan West, another huge mega project here in the Vesterbro neighborhood. A thriving, lively neighborhood with loads of cultural activities, bars, restaurants, you name it, really cool place to be. Today, this would have been completely gone.
City Plan West was a natural extension of the Lake Ring and was also first proposed in 1958. The Lake Ring would run down the lakes and then tuck into a tunnel before vomiting itself up in the Vesterbro neighborhood. This area near the central train station is where the lake ring would emerge, and this is what the first plan for City Plan West in 1958 would have looked like. A lot of original buildings would remain, and most of the infrastructure would be placed on the location of the meatpacking district. That changed over the next decade. By 1968, the plans had developed drastically. The scale of the motorway infrastructure had grown and would have run right through here. The Spaghetti Junction would have led cars to the south and on to the west and the rest of Denmark. But look at that. Now the entire neighborhood was slated for demolition, and huge new buildings were planned. Here are some of the places we know today. An unfathomable transformation. Most of the buildings in the renderings look like they're commercial, so one wonders where the thousands of people in the original apartments would have been sent to live. But notice that one building right there. Now a police precinct called Station City.
If you've ever been in the Vesterbro neighborhood and you've wondered, what the hell is this building doing here, completely out of context with the traditional architecture that surrounds it, it's because this was built in the early 1970s when these two plans were still alive, and they simply expected the motorway to come, and they started planning for it. But now, in this really cool neighborhood, it stands there looking all sad and awkward and out of place. This entire neighborhood was very poor back in the 1950s, 60s, and well into the 70s, and they just wanted it gone, razed to the ground, like we have seen in so many cities around the world. But it is wild to imagine that I would be standing underneath motorway flyovers. The lake ring was one thing, but there was this orgy of urban thinking back then, and everybody had crazy ideas. Getting rid of this neighborhood, working class Nørrebro neighborhood, raising it to the ground. There have been many proposals through the years to do that. There was one proposal for massive parking garages all the way along the lake so people could park there and take trams into the city center. But into the ring in 1970 was thrown another project right here on the other side of the lakes. It was called the Forumlinien.
A new transport minister, Ove Guldberg, launched the idea of the Forumline, or Forumlinien in Danish, in 1970. I stumbled across it a few years ago and could only find a couple of visualizations of it. Few people have ever heard of it, and it's hard to find any reference to it at all, even though it hung around for 2 years. I've stared at this drawing, one of the only ones that I could find, for more than a decade, wondering what the hell it is. Motorways above and to the left, and a Corbusier-esque street on the right, with car traffic below the new buildings. But right there in the center is a huge housing project on the lakes in Copenhagen. It looks like 6 floors high on the left and maybe up to 20 on the right, surrounded, of course, by leafy green areas. At first glance, this reminded me of the enormous holiday resort in France, Heliopolis in Cap d'Agde, built in the early 70s. Holiday apartments with guaranteed sun on every brutalist balcony, and a place where I spent a couple of holidays years ago. But you have to see where they were planning to put this monster. Right on top of a part of Denmark's most densely populated neighborhood, then and today, Nørrebro, and even over into the neighboring city of Frederiksberg on the left. Look at that. Total destruction. Total elimination of an undesirable low-income neighborhood. But recently, I finally found the original document. Very few remain, and it has taken me literally years, and it completely blew my mind. This is the full extent of the Forumline proposal. In response to the growing resistance against the lake ring, the government and city didn't propose a softer option. They went ballistic. The route runs through Nørrebro, Frederiksberg, and Vesterbro, and on to the south of the harbor. With morbid fascination, I zoomed in on the details and saw how my own neighborhood and many places I've lived in this city would have been completely destroyed. I can't imagine how many people would have been displaced, how many buildings would have been knocked down. Remember that weird round building? Well, I discovered it was just part of a row of them on the north shore of the lakes. This was one proposal for housing. Then there's this other one. There are loads of drawings in the document I found. Dystopic images of a future that was seriously proposed by politicians and the road directorate. A lot of work was put into this, with detailed maps of the entire route. There seems to be a lot of focus in all of these documents on one particular area of the Nørrebro neighborhood, near a square called Blågårdsplads. It just seems to be an epicenter for all of the plans to raze that entire neighborhood to the ground. After 2 years of work, the Forumline idea was killed off in 1972. It simply wasn't a feasible replacement for the lake ring. It's amazing to think that all of that over there would be gone.
Thank Odin that never happened. But this was the kind of insane thinking that was the norm back then, and unfortunately it's the norm in Copenhagen again today.
In 1972, the pushback had grown so strong that a last gasp attempt to save the project was proposed. Same, but different. It was underwater, a tunnel beneath the lakes instead of an elevated motorway. But the people didn't buy it. Time was running out for the Lake Ring project. Even back in 1965, there was pushback. One architect was the face of the project, Ole Nørgaard. He was quoted as saying this: "Copenhagen, in its development, has reached a point where it is necessary to expand a network of motorways through the city to ensure its orbital functions. Motorways will change the city's appearance. If this change is to be for the better, then the normal fear of development must be replaced by the courage to control that fear." Yeah, okay, Boomer. But as the years progressed, he and other proponents had to change their approach and start selling it differently, reassuring people that there would still be pedestrian access to the water, in certain places. We promise. Some publications fervently supported the whole idea. This article from a magazine called Samvirke wrote this: "Most of us mourn when the city grows and obliterates accustomed landscapes, but the coming city will have totally new values. Future generations will hopefully think that our age acted wisely and rightly when we finally pulled ourselves together and planned urban development." Oh boy. But a national newspaper called Politiken really added fuel to the fire of the protests in 1968 with an article entitled "The Lake Ring, Fake News or Fact?" Other right-leaning newspapers were still on board, but question marks started appearing. There are still leftovers from the project in this city. Large buildings, widened roads, but this one here, this has got to be the biggest. A motorway flyover called Bispeengbuen, which today is a piece of dinosaur infrastructure and a barrier between two thriving neighborhoods. It was opened in August 1972 at a time when protests against the huge projects were reaching a peak. After it opened, Copenhageners could see what the future might look like, and the protests, well, they increased a notch or two. No more wooden models to discuss. Now there was concrete evidence, quite literally, that motorways through the city, they were probably a bad idea. There is now a popular movement to remove this urban highway and to bring back the original stream, currently buried in a tube beneath the cars, like they've done in the Danish city of Aarhus, like they're doing in Milan, in Seoul, Korea. And it was also the early 70s back then, an age of radical social change. All these factors led to the Forumline and the Lake Ring projects being put to bed in 1972 and 1973, respectively. And of course, without the Lake Ring, City Plan West was rendered irrelevant.
It is completely mind-boggling to think about how close we were to having this negative, destructive urban planning forced down our throats here in the city of Copenhagen. Other cities in the world were not as lucky as us. But it is also just as mind-boggling to think about how there were humans living here who thought this was a good idea. It was a different era, I know that. It was a different generation of planners and engineers. But this is not only a tale of those crazy people back in the day, because it is still happening today in Copenhagen and in Denmark. Mega projects are still being planned. The environmental catastrophe that is the artificial island of Lynetteholm, the industry island south of the city here, the Kattegat connection, a motorway from this island over to the mainland in Denmark. These people have returned from the dead. It should have stopped decades ago, but it hasn't stopped just yet. But you know what? It has to. So remember, mega projects can die, and in most cases, must die, because they serve no purpose for the life-size city. So keep up the fight.